There's clearly going to be some movement in the coming months and years to having more guidance on, say, public disclosures and what qualifies as material in that sense. But right now, what a lot of companies are thinking about is really from your internal sort of risk management perspective, when you're coming up with your enterprise risk management frameworks, how are you looking at these risks? And those frameworks, as I understand them, are really meant to help companies sort of achieve their goals. And if their stated goals are, they have a human rights policy, they make these commitments, these internal risk management processes that top management deals with and making strategic decisions really should take that into consideration. And I think the companies are looking at it increasingly that way.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hidden Traffic. I am your host, Gwen Hassan, and I am very, very happy to have with me today a colleague who has become a friend over the last couple of years, Nathan Lankford, who prefers to go by Nate. Hi, Nate. How are you?
Hi, Gwen. Great to be with you.
Thanks. You too. Nate is the practice lead for business and human rights for Miller Chevalier in DC. And he's also the co-chair of the International Bar Association's Business and Human Rights Committee. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Gwen.
So tell me, first of all, how did you first become involved in human trafficking, and where does the interest spring from for you?
Well, thanks, Gwen. I should just say, I wish I had some fantastic origin story that was really dramatic, but it's actually a very straightforward case, I think, about seeing an opportunity to be useful and to have a positive impact. I started out as an art major. I went to law school eventually with this idea that the profession could give me an opportunity to help people in some way.
Make the world a better place, yeah.
Yeah, but it was pretty vague. And then when getting into it, being really drawn to international issues and corporate law, I thought that was just fascinating, especially I think many of us grow up with this kind of feeling like corporations are just these giant, all-powerful alien beings. And then you get to study them a bit more and realize they're made up of normal people trying to work through problems for the most part. And it's really interesting how you could have very well-intentioned groups of people like that, very intelligent people who can make very positive impacts on the one hand, very negative impacts on the other. I found that really, really fascinating. And so when I joined my firm, I really clicked with their anti-corruption compliance practice in the international department and just really found it fascinating. And of course, you know what corporate compliance means. I think it sounds really boring, the name corporate compliance, but I feel like it's helping people set the right culture, having the right structures in place to make sure you don't get into trouble and how to deal with it. If you do find misconduct, it's all these really, really human issues. And of course, it's related to investigations where we all just love to get in and find out the facts, what really happened, and deal with that.
I've always maintained actually that corporate compliance, most people don't realize how really sexy it is, because there are a lot of great stories that come out of compliance. Compliance people and HR people are the ones you want to have a couple of drinks at a cocktail party, because then all the stories come out. So I'm a big proponent of the fact that it's not nearly as boring as most people think it is.
Well, thank you. I feel like you get me, Gwen. So that's great. So this anti-corruption corporate compliance practice brought me into much of my work was traveling globally to high-risk countries. And I could name a bunch of examples in different regions. Like West Africa was a big focus. I think I've made more trips than anybody else in my firm to Equatorial Guinea. That's like my claim to fame here. Eastern Europe and Asia, places like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Ukraine, even in recent years, and thinking a lot about our friends over there right now. Around the Mediterranean, like Algeria and whatnot, and Italy, Latin America, like all these places where you have very high corruption risks, very quickly discover that corruption risks tend to correlate with a lot of different other types of corporate compliance risks in these locations. And so from very early on, we were asked by clients to look at multiple risk areas so we could provide a holistic view of the risks that they face. And I have to say, I personally love the experience of going to places that are just really remote, that you would never be for any other reason. I mean, it's like about the best possible day for me to be in a construction trailer office, with like the smell of pesticide or something, and like just having a real conversation with somebody, hearing about their experiences, even if you're just going through, say, procurement processes or whatever, but just really having a real connection with somebody and understanding where they're coming from, the kind of risks that the company's facing is just a fascinating thing. And to really just use those opportunities to explore different risk areas. And so it was really through that learned about forced labor being a very major risk area for multinational companies and it just increasing over the years, and really using those discussions to probe those kind of areas as well. And so, to be frank, I really had to just read up on it, studying indicators, a lot of research into just the field of laws internationally and domestically in this area, the different types of laws, how they intersect with voluntary standards and this evolving sort of soft law area. And it really just made me look at things very differently. I think we've all had that experience when you read up about this subject and being to talk to people, who've had these experiences of just like, it really makes you look at things differently, like your choices and what kind of toothpaste you buy, or, like your shirt, where it's made, like things like that. And these companies that you think of as, very wanting to do good as employers, as business partners, as just members of our society, but really having some very serious potential negative effects in their upstream, and that we have a chance to do something about it. So that was really a great sort of development in my path, is just to see that I'm really in a position where I can help companies to do something positive about this.
And to make a difference in that. Yeah. Kind of reducing the demand side of the equation when it comes to human trafficking, I think is something, it's the reason I created the podcast, was because I felt like it was an area that wasn't really being focused on very much. And that there was a lot of focus on both the victims, maybe not enough focus on victims, but the perpetrators, the evildoers who are out there trafficking people, without understanding that the people that are benefiting from that labor are more often than not a corporation. Right? They're the ones who are getting the cheap labor or avoiding the recruiting costs or all of the above. So being able to educate people that are inside of companies, like, corporate compliance practitioners, to kind of leverage their budgets to try and fight this and reduce the demand side, I think is an exciting opportunity. Or at least in my nerd category, I nerd out on that. I think it's great. So yeah, I'm glad you're doing the same work. Fill the listeners in a little bit about kind of human rights practice. Are we talking kind of UN guiding principles here? And if so, how does that intersect with or overlap with human trafficking? How do they connect?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's a great place to start, is with the UN guiding principles in business and human rights. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, and I know you are, Gwen, but this framework that was unanimously endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011, which really reflects this broad consensus about companies having a responsibility to respect human rights. And this is in this framework where they talk about states, as in governments, duty to protect and to respect human rights. And I think for businesses, this respect concept is very important to understand really what it means. Like, of course, governments have the primary responsibility to protect, meaning to have laws against these kinds of issues and to enforce them. But for companies, it's really to make sure that your actions aren't interfering with somebody enjoying their rights. And for the forced labor issues, you can really see how that manifests itself. I think, one clear example is if, a company works with a supplier who engages in forced labor practices or is at high risk of that, then a company's actions, because of its business relationships, can affect these workers' rights that are upstream. Yeah. So the UNGP framework is really, really important to understand, I think, for compliance professionals, because it underpins not only the strategies that you put in place to deal with this issue, but also really how these new hard laws are being conceived and structured and enforced these days. So really understanding that framework is a really great starting point. And the main building blocks of that under the responsibility to respect human rights are to make a public policy commitment, from senior management that the company is committed to respecting the human rights of its stakeholders. The second part being a company must conduct due diligence, which of course is a term of art, to identify its human rights risks and then to make sure that it handles them properly. And then the third part is facilitating effective remediation when you identify that you've had adverse impacts. I have to say, this notion of due diligence is really the heart of, I think, what a lot of people spend their day jobs doing to assess risks, to make sure you're handling them properly. And it really overlaps, I think, with all these fundamental classic compliance program components, but with a different lens, which is really important to get when you get into the business and human rights space, which is you're not just looking at risk to the corporation in terms of potential liability and economic consequences. You have to get into a mindset that's a real shift to look at it from your rights holder perspective, these things like evaluating risks and severity from the perspective of a vulnerable stakeholder, like a worker, like a community member, things like that. That's really important. And then another really big difference is the focus on transparency. It's not all behind the curtain and like we mostly encounter with anti-corruption kind of compliance processes. In the UNGP kind of framework here, this idea of meaningful stakeholder engagement is hugely important at all stages to have that kind of input from people whose rights may be affected.
You can't have meaningful engagement without being transparent. Is that the connection there?
Big emphasis on reporting, consultation, and this idea of it really being meaningful, meaning that you're just not getting up and giving somebody a training presentation. It's actually really sitting down and hearing what people and taking their input and feedback seriously.
You used a bunch of words in there that immediately ring ESG bells for me, right? Yeah. You're talking about stakeholders, you're talking about transparency, public commitments by senior management and board, meaningful engagement. All of those things sound to me like we're talking about ESG, which you can't turn a corner without hearing about these days, or really not hearing about getting smacked in the face with, because it's just everywhere. Where do you think that human rights practice, and more specifically, human trafficking and forced labor, fit within ESG? Is it a matter of kind of social justice? Is it a matter of governance? Is it both? Are they inextricably connected? So it shouldn't be one or the other, but it should always be both. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I want to say I love ESG, even though it's kind of right now a bit all over the place. But what I do like about it, though, is that it's giving this common language that you can talk about the importance of a lot of these issues and the business case for managing these kind of risks effectively and in a way that's helpful. When you talk about things in terms of access to capital and that certain criteria are being looked at by your investors and other stakeholders, it's helpful for the conversation, even if there are obviously a lot of things that are being worked out in this field in terms of consistency and reliability and whatnot. I do think it's a positive development, this focus on ESG. And as far as where it sits, we really do tend to think about human rights and particularly forced labor, human trafficking as an S topic, because it tends to go along with other people-focused issues like community relations, labor relations, health and safety, those kind of things. So it sort of is traditionally viewed there, but it certainly is a G issue as well. And that's because it ties into these existing compliance program frameworks and governance structures. And when you think about, say, a policy and procedure framework, third-party due diligence controls,
audit framework,
exactly, and enterprise risk management frameworks. So, these are all very important considerations to tie together when you're thinking of an overall business and human rights strategy and working in issues like forced labor into it. And I should say, just if you're wondering if ESG criteria really call out specifically forced labor and human trafficking, they really do for many industries. And a couple of the ones that I'm just more familiar with than others is mining and extractives. It's called out there. Really heavy focus on the electronics manufacturing sectors. Yeah. Like if you look at the SASB standards, it really has a lot on that using existing RBA frameworks from the Responsible Business Alliance.
Let's say that you're talking to a new client who is an in-house compliance person and they're feeling like a deer in headlights, right? They can see the train it's coming towards them, but they don't even know where to start. Should they grab themselves a copy of the UN Guiding Principles? Should they start with a risk assessment? Both? Where do you think a practitioner can have the biggest bang for the buck in terms of their in-house practice to make a difference in this area?
That's a great question. It is one we get a lot. And I think it's really just important to keep it simple. You don't have to be an expert on international law to start this process and make a difference. I think what you said right there about understanding your risks is always a place to start. I know everybody knows this. If you're going to have a effective compliance strategy, it really does need to be based on risks and your own company's unique profile.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so for, issues like forced labor and human trafficking, the way you tend to start that is mapping your supply chain typically, because that's often the biggest risk is these kind of upstream relationships in certain areas. And I think it's good to have input on, say, what are the high risk kinds of materials that you need to be more worried about than others, because there's a lot of important developments, I think, in the way these laws are being enforced right now, like with the U.S. prohibition on imports made with forced labor, where, say, if you're...
The Uyghur Act as well coming in. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. Which is really going to ratchet things up, I think, because you have certain industries that are currently really in the crosshairs of enforcement for that, with a lot of shipments being detained, like agriculture, cotton. Solar, cotton and apparel, thousands of shipments detained. So I think if you're dealing those kind of materials that are really hot topics, there's a lot of work to be done to get up that supply chain upstream as far as you can, to say, where are you sourcing your silicon metal from, like all the way back there. But then, like with this new UFLPA coming out, you could see that industry sort of target potentially expanding. And so I think really understanding your supply chain, just mapping it out, understanding what are the more critical, higher risk production inputs is very important. Then once you map those out, you develop a strategy for how to deal with them, like in terms of due diligence and safeguards and whatnot. But I think the basics are really this risk mapping as a starting point. And at the same time, there's no reason to wait to get a solid supplier code of conduct in place and starting to sensitize people to the risks. Because as you know, from any compliance area, when people start getting sensitized to these risks, you start having these discussions, news about your company's risks tends to find you when you start having those discussions. I think those are like the three things we tend to focus on, is where do we start?
Also important. And I want to tie back to something that you mentioned earlier, which is along with conducting a risk assessment and mapping out your supply chain and looking at your specific risks, there's an opportunity for in-house practitioners, especially, to try and do some internal lobbying for a new definition of materiality. Because something you've talked about briefly before was the shift towards considering who your stakeholders really are. And historically, a lot of companies, especially U.S. companies, have considered the financial markets as their shareholders. Those shareholders are the stakeholders and the ones that they want to please. So it's a financial measure of materiality. But we're already seeing, especially in Europe, a move towards kind of a dual materiality measure, right? Where it's no longer just, will this potentially impact the company's financials, but will it impact the community it works in? Will it impact its workers? Will it impact the surrounding areas of wherever their business is taking place? Will it have an impact on a supplier or a supply chain? So that, I think, is going to be an adjustment for a lot of major companies, the move towards not only considering financial materiality, but also looking at kind of human rights materiality as well.
Exactly. I think that's such an interesting moment we're at in thinking about that materiality issues. And because I think there's clearly going to be some movement in the coming months and years to having more guidance on, say, public disclosures and what qualifies as material in that sense. But right now, what a lot of companies are thinking about is really from your internal sort of risk management perspective, when you're coming up with your enterprise risk management frameworks, how are you looking at these risks? And those frameworks, as I understand them, are really meant to help companies sort of achieve their goals. And if their stated goals are, they have a human rights policy, they make these commitments, these internal risk management processes that top management deals with and making strategic decisions really should take that into consideration. And I think the companies are looking at it increasingly that way.
Ideally, in a perfect world, though, they should spring from those goals, right? If you're making public commitments to human rights, then your business processes, your business measures of success should spring from those commitments and from really a values-based place, theoretically, right? That a company's actions and public commitments and statements and goals should all align with the company's values, which, if you go back to the Milton Friedberg days, the purpose of the company is to make money. I think that has changed and is changing, and we'll see more and more change in that area where companies are realizing that their values and their goals are more than just making money. They're about trying to make the world a better place too. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been fascinating. Any information that you can share with the listeners about how to get in touch with you and how to learn more about human rights and its intersection with human trafficking? Where should people contact you?
People can find my contact info on my firm's website. So please, always happy to chat. And, especially people who are new to this area. And as far as resources go, just really so much out there. But I think for me, a great place to start is, of course, getting familiar with the UN Guiding Principles framework is just fantastic. And I think that when you look at, say, especially if you're interested in, say, supply chain issues having to do with forced labor and human trafficking, I tend to go to these publications by Verite and the US government that are always cited as, check this out, in official guidance as well. And of course, we always pay close attention to what the regulators and enforcers are pointing to as this is reliable. So I think we tend to go to those. And I'm happy to provide further details. If anybody's interested, please send me an email.
Thank you so much for your time and for talking with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Gwen. It's a pleasure.